I think there is some competition regarding who's living in the most beautiful part of Australia. I'm speaking to you from Bundjalung country in the Northern Rivers, far north of New South Wales, and I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Trauma-informed care is an approach to healthcare that recognises and responds to the impacts of traumatic experiences on individuals' physical, mental and emotional health. It's an aspirational framework that aims to create a supportive, safe and empowering environments for people who have had experience of trauma. Being trauma-informed involves understanding the prevalence and effects of trauma and how it can affect an individual. The trauma-informed practitioner is aware that trauma impacts on the neuroception of safety and that any kind of therapy must proceed by first restoring a sense of safety. The trauma-informed practitioner is concerned about facilitating access to treatment and the right package of care to mitigate the impacts of trauma. I expect we can all agree on these broad principles, and it does sound infinitely sensible. However, is it even possible in the context of the Australian mental health system? So to explore this question and what might need to be addressed, I'm going to invite you to take a systemic view of the mental health system, at least in New South Wales, hence the balloon metaphor and the image. Most of us, most of the time, do not operate or even think in a systemic way. More often than not, in our institutions, the extent of systemic awareness is manifested in blaming the system and thus absolving any individual from responsibility or accountability for poor outcomes. So when someone runs amok and hurts people, when we discover that they've had or have or were diagnosed with a mental illness, the usual response in Australia is to commission yet another expensive public inquiry, which will inevitably and quite unimaginatively conclude that there were systemic failings and that the system is broken, and then to recommend that we need more resources, more doctors, more nurses, and higher salaries and subsidies for various guilds who are already the most highly and perhaps overpaid in the world. My colleagues Francis Johnson and Wilson in 2022 concluded that there has been on average more than an inquiry a year for the last 30 years, each costing tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, so billions of dollars, involving 55,000 public submissions, 9,000 witnesses, 1,000 days of hearings and over 67 years of time running and awaiting findings. We are indeed the lucky country. And what has changed? I would suggest not much. Indeed, even though trauma-informed care appears to reflect the current zeitgeist, I don't think our services have improved at all since I cut my teeth as a mental health nurse in the 1980s. I could have entitled the presentation "The Impossibility of Trauma-Informed Care." Our public mental health units and the means of accessing them are highly traumatogenic. They are by and large unsafe places and spaces. The majority of people are coerced and detained and not even offered recognised treatment for trauma or indeed comprehensive and effective treatment for anything. Some surveys have found that the majority of people hospitalised in our mental health units have symptoms of PTSD related to the experience of hospitalisation. In this context, how can a sense of safety be restored and maintained at all? I will save the critique of the system until the end and first outline how a sense of safety is impacted by trauma and why restoring a sense of safety should be the first imperative of any organisation that aspires to provide trauma-informed care. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Johanna Lynch for sharing this infographic and quote from Abraham Maslow relating to safety and protection. As Maslow informed us in the 1950s, basic human functioning and well-being is dependent on meeting basic needs and a sense of safety. In the asylum era, mental health services were concerned about providing for the basic physiological needs of service users. Today, with the extent of the medicalisation of distress, the high prevalence of people identifying as experiencing mental illness, and the narrowing of what counts as treatment to largely medication, it would be impossible for mental health services to comprehensively provide for such basic needs. However, this doesn't diminish their importance. Some commentators have argued that the closure of large asylums or institutions has led to an increase in the number of people with serious mental illness who are homeless or imprisoned. I've spent a considerable period of my career working in the homeless sector. It remains the case that the most effective treatment, that is what really makes a difference in terms of reducing symptoms of psychosis, substance misuse and criminal offending, is the provision of a safe place to be. Programs such as Housing First. Housing First is an approach to addressing homelessness that prioritises providing individuals with stable and permanent housing as a first step, without preconditions such as sobriety or participation in treatment programs. Numerous studies have demonstrated that Housing First programs result in improved housing stability over time, reduced emergency service usage, and improvements in physical and mental health outcomes. These programs ultimately lead to people meeting higher level needs such as social inclusion, community integration, and a sense of belonging. My direct experience with people has been that when people are in a safe place and have a sense of safety restored, then psychiatric symptoms tend to diminish. And only then can we get on with therapy, healing, and recovery. My analysis is that treatment failure, whether response to a medication or psychotherapy, is most often related to a failure to focus on stabilisation, meeting these basic needs and restoring a sense of safety in potentially helpful relationships and in life in general. I use the term sense of safety quite purposefully here, and I'd like to just recap some basic and oversimplified neuroscience around how a sense of safety may be impacted by trauma and prolonged stress, drawing mostly on polyvagal theory. But first of all, I'd like to look at something that predates polyvagal theory. We've known for a long time now about what happens when our sense of safety is compromised due to the impacts of trauma, and what happens to us when our sense of safety is compromised. First of all, there are changes to the way we think. There are essentially two modes of thinking. The primary mode of thinking is sometimes known as the slow cortical mode. This mode primarily relies on the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher order cognitive functions such as planning, decision-making, and reasoning. The prefrontal cortex integrates information from various brain regions and processes it in a deliberate analytical manner. Additionally, the hippocampus is involved in memory formation and retrieval, and it plays a role in accessing past experiences and knowledge to inform decision-making in slow cortical mode. When all is well with us, we can learn, we can recall memories, and we can process information extremely effectively. In contrast, better safe than sorry thinking is highly reactive. It's narrowly focused and it's mobilised by the amygdala when threat is sensed. People go into fight or flight mode. Essentially, higher order information processing is disabled. The prefrontal cortex goes offline and people go into automatic survival mode. In chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, there is sometimes seen a reduction in the volume of the prefrontal cortex as people spend much of their time in this amygdala-driven survival state. Interestingly, and something of an aside, in psychosis in which people may develop delusional ideas, it may be this better safe than sorry mode of thinking which drives people to develop strong convictions around their beliefs. In this mode of thinking, whatever you think and whatever you feel is fact. Now, reducing people's anxiety, essentially dampening down the central nervous system, has also been a time-tested and effective response to reducing symptoms of psychosis. A problem with the exclusively pharmacological approach to addressing psychosis is that one can reduce anxiety and disrupt this mode of thinking, but by and large, tranquilizers, whether major or minor, don't enhance higher order thinking. Practitioners of cognitive behavioural therapy and psychosis often work to strengthen this higher order mode of thinking, reflexive capacity and mentalisation. And we reinforce insights such as a strong feeling does not make something a fact, or our thoughts are not facts. and our minds are capable of generating all manner of ideas. This slide is circa 1995, when I ran a workshop on CBT for psychosis. This was before the term mentalisation was even popularised. We now know that trauma, prolonged stress and various adversities or invalidation at formative stages of development impact on people's capacity to mentalise. That is the psychological process by which an individual understands and interprets their own mental state and those of others. Again, nothing new here at all. However, how many service users actually get offered CBT for psychosis, or indeed a safe place to be or a safe place to belong? This is old news about what actually works. The hippocampus is a brain structure located in the temporal lobe that's important for memory formation and recall. It helps to encode new memories, store them, and retrieve them when needed. It's critical for learning, impulse control, and self-regulation. The hippocampus plays an inhibiting role on the amygdala, but exposure to trauma, toxic stress, or prolonged activation of the fight or flight response and the stress hormone cortisol can lead to a shrinkage of the hippocampus or at least a reduction in its activities. People so affected may have learning difficulties, memory problems, problems with emotional regulation and impulse control. Do you know people with these kinds of problems? Now, PTSD is widely construed by psychotherapists as a problem of memory processing, and in particular, painful thoughts and feelings associated with the traumatic event. Again, nothing particularly new here. People who experience trauma have problems with processing information when triggered, for want of a better word, into a fight or flight state. And some people become chronically entrenched in that state. A lot of what health professionals may see as symptoms of mental illness may be a consequence of exposure to toxic stress, adversity, or trauma. So what is new? The polyvagal theory, which has already been mentioned today, was developed by Stephen Porges, and it offers us some new insights about how trauma might impact us. The key concepts, as I see them here, are the idea of neuroception, the elaboration of the social engagement system, and the idea that there is a hierarchy of predictable pathways and responses to various levels of stress. Firstly, neuroception refers to the subconscious process by which the nervous system evaluates cues from the environment to determine whether it is safe, dangerous, or potentially life-threatening. These are unconscious processes that involve rapid and automatic assessment of environmental cues, including facial expression, vocal intonations, body language, and other subtle cues to detect potential threats or to detect safety. I do wish to underline that this is unconscious or pre-conscious. So this is not a conscious evaluation of threat in the environment. Most of you will be familiar with the sympathetic nervous system responsible for fight or flight, the body's accelerator. And you'll have some appreciation that the parasympathetic nervous system is essentially the body's brake. And there are two pathways. One, the ventral vagal, which is activated when there is a neuroception of safety. When we, like most animals, feel safe, we eat, we play, we socialise, we learn, and we're able to connect with others. The second branch, or dorsal vagal branch, leads to shutdown when exposed to extreme or imminent danger. This is a very primitive response which we share with most animals. And according to the theory, we move up and down this ladder in predictable ways. One doesn't jump from top to bottom. So we do have an understanding that the sympathetic nervous system can be more readily triggered or chronically activated in people who have had a range of trauma or adverse experiences. However, what happens to the neuroception of safety in those who have experienced trauma? This is, after all, in some sense, representative of a state of wellness. Experiences of trauma can profoundly disrupt people's neuroception of safety. Cues that for most people might lead to a neuroception of safety may be experienced as threats, For example, someone being offered a caring embrace or even being offered help. Even the experience of success or feeling okay and safe for a period of time may lead to a neuroception that one is unsafe. Trauma can erode trust in oneself and others, making it challenging to establish and maintain healthy relationships. Individuals may struggle to feel safe in the presence of others, leading to social withdrawal or avoidance as a means of self-protection. Trauma survivors may be stuck in a state of sympathetic arousal, characterised by hypervigilance and a constant sense of threat. In this state, even minor cues in the environment can trigger a fight or flight response, making it difficult for individuals to feel safe or be at ease. People may, of course, have difficulty regulating emotions and their behaviour when in this state. In response to neuroception of threat, trauma survivors may rapidly shift into dorsal vagal mode, leading to immobilisation and shutdown. And this can manifest as dissociation, numbness, or feeling disconnected from oneself or the environment. In this state, individuals may struggle to accurately perceive safety cues or engage socially. In light of this understanding about the impacts of trauma, the number one imperative ought to be to restore a sense of safety and then assist people to maintain a sense of safety. A neuroception of safety is essential for learning, social engagement, engaging in therapy, and for promoting healing and well-being. Many people who access mental health services exhibit dysregulated behaviour and emotions. This is indicative of people neurocepting threat for whatever reason. I've argued elsewhere that treatment failure and dropouts from therapeutic programs is largely a failure to achieve stabilisation prior to or in the early phases of psychotherapy. This entails the provision of basic human needs, safety, and facilitating a sense of safety within the psychotherapeutic relationship. If you would like to read this chapter, you can look me up on ResearchGate where there is a copy. Whilst I'm discussing psychotherapy here, in which a staged approach to treatment is now widely recognised as necessary, I would extend this idea to mental health care in general. People are not treatment resistant, in my view. People don't improve because we don't facilitate a place of safety or focus on basic needs. And are people improving? At this point, I invite you to hop upon the high altitude balloon and try and view mental health services from a systemic perspective. Australia punches above its weight when it comes to expenditure on mental health, the number of doctors and nurses, and we actually have a massive number of psychologists relative to most other Western countries. On many proxy measures of well-being, we're doing fine. People are seeking treatment. Close to 20% of us each year. We are within the top 2 to 3 most medicated countries in the world. However, our suicide rates are increasing, and multiple studies suggest that overall the mental health of the nation has been declining since 2010. Millennials now apparently have poorer mental health than any former generation. This systemic failure to improve our well-being is not what I wish to amplify, although I think the failure to appreciate that psychotherapy is treatment and that our narrow psychomedical conceptions of treatment are fundamentally flawed is quite related. In relation to our public mental health system, which is supposed to support those most in need, 30+ inquiries and the outcomes of care in our public system suggest some bigger problems. We can now claim to be one of the most coercive countries in the world. The majority of people who use our public mental health services have been or are coerced. We know that coercion is highly associated with symptoms of PTSD, with so-called voluntary patients being just as prone to being traumatised by being processed in our coercive care systems. So how is this working? Does it help and does it work? I think not. However, there are a whole generation of psychiatrists, nurses and allied health professionals that know no different than the current system. Those at the coalface, for the most part, simply do their job as they are taught to and really give much thought to the bigger picture. Some do this very well and some service users recover and get well, not because of the system, but despite it. If one were to design a trauma-informed mental health system, or even one that actually worked, we would never have the system we have now. The current system privileges antiquated models of care, which have not changed for decades. These are medico-centric rather than person-centred, pharmacocentric rather than focused on psychosocial support, risk-obsessed and increasingly protocol-driven. It relegates most clinicians to being cogs in a machine. And this would be fine if the output was improved mental health or even effective treatment for so-called serious mental illness. It isn't. The system creates chronicity and then blames the patient and their families for being treatment resistant when they don't get better, even though people are not even offered the treatment in most instances. I'll shift my attention away from New South Wales for a moment. I last worked in an emergency department in Queensland. This photo was taken in what was then known as the mental health pod, a truly dangerous place to be. This bulletproof glass was shattered by somebody that ripped out the porcelain tub and threw it at the door. When I first worked in Queensland in around the year 2000, there was no mental health presence in emergency departments. There were no guards, the wards were all unlocked, and Queensland rapidly went from around 600 people being brought to emergency departments by what were then known as EEOs in the early 2000s to over 14,000 in 2015. So an EEO allows police or paramedics to bring people in involuntarily to any emergency department for assessment in Queensland, or at least they did. Of course, only a tiny fraction of these people were assessed as needing involuntary treatment. However, by 2015, the expectation that any kind of emotional or behavioural disturbance warranted a trip to ED was well entrenched, as was the belief that individuals need to be held involuntarily, essentially locked in and prevented from running away by security guards until assessed. Now, with the shift to what was now called emergency examination authorities in the Public Health Act, which loosened the criteria for involuntary assessment to incapacity for any reason, it's likely that the rates of coercion have continued to increase. We don't know because there is no legal requirement for anyone to count the number of EEAs. It's just such a non-event. However, if we extrapolate this regression line, there would be in excess of 20,000 presentations per year in Queensland about now. Coercion has been normalised, but how does being transported by police or ambulance to an emergency department to be guarded and prevented from leaving until assessed actually help people with a history of trauma? People who are likely to be dysregulated and rapidly be triggered into a neuroception of danger. A lot of the time, I felt unsafe in this environment. I can't count the number of people who were brought to the emergency department and then chemically restrained. This wasn't even counted and still isn't counted as a restrictive practice in Australia. A year or two ago, there was a parliamentary inquiry into Queensland's mental health system. I and others, such as the psychiatrist Dr. Neeraj Gill, made submissions about the outrageous rates of coercion and the mandated locked door policy in Queensland. This didn't even rate a mention in the final report. That's how unremarkable coercion is. Of course, New South Wales is not actually that much different. This from the New South Wales Police magazine in September 2023. The authors don't mince words here. They state a system failing everyone. It's hardly the beginning of a therapeutic alliance when one starts one's journey, or mental health journey or recovery journey, however you want to frame it, in the back of a paddy wagon. My experience was that only a minority of people brought to emergency departments were admitted, but those who don't rapidly regulate their emotions and behaviour within neat targets or after being droperidoled are deemed to need admission. This is an interesting usage of the term need. Let's just return to Maslow for a moment. Some people may benefit from admission to a mental health unit. However, what need is being fulfilled? These are basic human needs. What need does coerced hospitalisation fulfil? What treatment is being dispensed and does it work? A recent study undertaken with the cooperation of New South Wales Health found that 54% of patients experienced at least one day of involuntary care over the last 3 years. And this speaks nothing about the coercive pathway to being assessed or the duress which so-called voluntary patients experience. The same study found that one was much more likely to be involuntarily treated in New South Wales if you were not born in Australia. About 40% more likely if you were born in Asia, 30% if you were born in Africa or the Middle East, and 20% if you were born in New Zealand or the Pacific. Again, what needs are being met here? Arguably, it's a clinician's anxiety that is being palliated in this process of processing people. This reminds me of Tom Main's very famous aphorism from The Ailment, published in 1957. The sufferer who frustrates a keen therapist by failing to improve is always in danger of meeting primitive human behaviour disguised as treatment. This is as true today, even more so, I think, as it was then. Australia is now one of the most coercive nations in the world, with over 55% of all overnight stays in mental health units being involuntary. At 227.3 involuntary hospitalisations per 100,000 Australians, Australia's rate is 16 times that of Italy, 3.1 times that of New Zealand, 2.3 times the incidence of Scotland. It's a mere 1.5 times the rate of Finland, but in Finland, the patient's opinion must be taken into account before treatment can be ordered, and the person is provided with independent court-appointed legal counsel, and so on. In systemic thinking, the escalating levels of coercion is an example of a redundant attempted solution. You might want to look that one up. This is the paradox whereby efforts to solve a problem appear to amplify it and make it worse. You can also note the extreme variations across states in Australia, with New South Wales having 5 times the rate of involuntary treatment as WA, for example. Even non-traumatised people are unlikely to experience a neuroception of safety, connection and social engagement at almost any point in the care and engagement process. Is it any wonder that people don't, by and large, recover in this system? Trauma-informed care cannot be grafted onto this dysfunctional and unsafe system. Reducing coercion, restoring a sense of safety requires more than some legislative tinkering, improving the aesthetics of our acute services or employing more consumer consultants. It actually requires a fundamental change in the culture of psychiatry. The psychiatrist Tom Saz was almost written out of history and quite systemically ignored in his lifetime. You might know him from his famous text, The Myth of Mental Illness. But far from being an anti-psychiatrist, he consistently called out coercion. This did not win him many friends. I perhaps don't go as far as Saz and argue that there might not be occasions when, in the interest of public safety, coercion may be necessary. But in Australia, the threshold is so incredibly low, and it begins well before people even get to hospital. In medical ethics, a person's autonomy is of paramount importance. People have the right to make decisions about their own bodies. This includes the right to refuse any medical procedure or intervention, even if it's recommended by health professionals or is life-saving. Why should it be any different in psychiatry? I will leave you to ponder that. Or you might consider why one is 5 times more likely to be involuntarily treated in New South Wales than in WA. Are the treatments 5 times more effective? Are psychiatrists in New South Wales 5 times more incompetent? Are people in New South Wales 5 times more crazy? I certainly don't think it's that New South Wales is 5 times poorer or the sector is 5 times less well-resourced. I've actually had around 15 years of postgraduate education, and I'm one of about 25,000 highly qualified psychotherapists in Australia who on average are underemployed and earn close to the minimum wage. As a person with a background in nursing, the oldest regulated allied health profession in the world by decades, with a history of providing psychotherapy to those most in need, myself and my occupation are as confined to work in these coercive environments as patients. Successive federal governments over the last 20 years have excluded us and qualified psychotherapists from receiving 1 cent of subsidy for our work in public systems. It is not ethical, and it frankly doesn't work to expect that nurses will simply be the strong arm of psychiatry and inject wellness into people on doctors' orders. People ought to be offered treatment, and this includes the right dose and type of psychotherapy delivered by the right people in a timely way. Coercion is a human rights issue. Others, at least on the margins, and I'm quoting a fairly recent paper here, continue to argue that this level of coercion is not right. It cannot be justified on any grounds and must be challenged and changed. There is no positive outcome of treatment of any kind without a therapeutic alliance. And how can one build alliances in the system? It does happen, but this is despite the system, not because of it. But I do appreciate that the final part of my talk today has been something of a seditious polemic. And I do appreciate that most people are well-intentioned and sometimes highly skilled and can actually do wonders despite the coercive contexts in which they work. I salute you all. However, I do invite you to consider to what extent trauma-informed care can be realised without some serious systemic change. And if you are interested in how I might adapt some of the neuroscience in service of people's recovery in inpatient units, I do invite you to go and have a look at my website, which is www.workingforrecovery.com, and looking a little bit further at looking at therapy resources. And you can access a template for restoring what I call an R&R plan, a plan to restore a sense of safety and detail resources for recovery and relapse prevention. This was something that I developed to support a 2-week inpatient group therapy program that really is about restoring a sense of safety. Thank you for bearing with me. I know that was probably quite a difficult presentation to listen to for some people.